So my name's Cole Stangler. I'm a journalist, contributor to Jacobin, The Nation, The Atlantic, In These Times, other outlets. I used to be a staff writer at In These Times magazine, based in DC, covering Congress and national politics for them. And then I worked also at International Business Times in New York, covering labor in the workplace for them. And I'm both a citizen of the United States and France. I was born here in Paris.
And so what sort of brought you to France? How were what's sort of the intersection, I guess, of the subjects you were following in the U.S. and then here in France?
Yeah, I came to France as a journalist to freelance ahead of the 2017 presidential election, and instinctively drawn to making parallels between the U.S. and France. Sometimes they don't always exist, but I think in both cases there's a fracturing of the kind of political establishment and a sense of uncertainty around the future, both for good and bad. And interesting seeing how French labor is also different from the American labor movement, and obviously much more powerful, but at an institutional level. But I mean, constantly as a writer drawn to making these kinds of parallels between the U.S. and France.
Cool. And so I'd love if you could kind of walk us through how did we get from I guess the election of Macron to the Yellow Vest movement, sort of what precipitated kind of where we are now?
Yeah, so I think Emmanuel Macron was elected in spring 2017, and from the very beginning, this was a president. I think it's one of the most important things to point out about Macron is this is someone who did not have significant support from the very beginning. If you looked at his victory over Marine Le Pen, the candidate of what was then the National Front, that has since become the National Rally Party, rebranded itself the far right, Macron won with a really significant margin in that second round of the vote. But the fact of the matter is that most people were voting for Macron because they wanted to deny the presidency to Marine Le Pen. So Macron wins this election with over 60% of the vote in the second round. He then wins a pretty substantial legislative majority in the National Assembly, also on the heels of some of the lowest turnout we've seen in the history of the Fifth Republic in France. Nevertheless, he has this big institutional mandate basically to implement his agenda. And I think from the very beginning, I think I was making a case, but many other people making the case. I think it was fairly obvious to most observers here in France that there never really was a popular mandate for Macron's agenda, which is a very pro-business agenda, a very kind of classically neoliberal agenda in the sense that it involves the state withdrawing from civic life and the economy at the expense of the private sector. Macron talked about turning France into a startup nation and unleashing, the economy's potential. France is the sixth or seventh, sometimes fifth largest economy, depending on how you measure it and what year. But anyway, it was one of the world's largest economies, and Macron wanted to really, dynamize the French economy even further. So that was very much his agenda. And what we saw from his up until November of 2018, when the LS movement kicked off, was Macron pretty much implementing his agenda, and that involved in his very first budget passing a massive tax cut for the super rich. And when I say for the super rich, this really applied to the super rich. France had a wealth tax that applied to people with over 1.3 million euros in assets. That was passed by the Socialist administration before in the 1980s under Mitterrand, and the right had repealed it before then. In any case, it was intact, and Macron, in his very first budget, his very first act as president, was to say, we need to get rid of this wealth tax on the super rich. And he reduced it substantially, so now that it applies only to housing, property, to real estate. So huge tax cut for the super rich. Was I think a really critical part of his agenda. Another important part of that first budget was a decrease in low-income housing aid. We've seen a freeze in a lot of a freeze in public spending. And we've also seen another important pillar of Macron's agenda, I think, just getting to the Yellow Vest movement, was these labor reforms. So Macron basically, the short version without going into the intricacies of French collective bargaining, basically making it easier for companies to lay off workers, and making it easier for companies to negotiate more flexible, quote unquote, flexible agreements with unions. So giving basically business more power, and also reducing the penalties that courts were providing to laid off workers. So really, this full onslaught of Macron trying to implement his pro-business agenda. His approval ratings had been sliding slightly from the moment he took over office, so below 50%. And then in November 2018, getting to the Yellow Vest movement, we saw this seemingly spontaneous outburst of protest, and that was anchored in specifically this question of the fuel tax, increase, but it's obviously not just about that.
And so tell me about actually the fuel tax as kind of the origins of this, because I've seen a lot of Americans latch onto that as the motivation, but it seems like it's really a small portion of what they've kind of grown into as a platform.
Yeah, I think this goes much deeper than the question of the fuel tax. So just to put things into perspective, and I think this is why it's important to draw the differences between France and the U.S. So first off, in France, people make a lot less money than the U.S. France has a much better safety net, and I think in a lot of ways, working class people have more protection, and that's a good thing. But if you look at just the brute levels of income, French people make less money. That's an important point to draw. Second point is that gas in France is far more expensive than it is in the U.S. The U.S. has all kinds of tax subsidies for the oil and gas industry. In France, the policy response has been different. It's been to put taxes on fuel. And so gas in France costs over about $6.50 a gallon, which is a lot of money. And when you take into account that people are making less money, they're spending a lot of money on fuel, and especially people that live outside of major urban areas. I mean, this is a major chunk of their income is going towards fuel, to be able to drive to work, to be able to live their lives. So when the government announced in the fall that they were going to be increasing the fuel tax, in spite of these very high prices, in spite of actually an increase of 25% over the last year, this really enraged people. And so the fuel tax was this kind of trigger for a much deeper pent-up frustration with the government, and a pent-up frustration about people's living standards, and ability to live meaningful, fruitful lives when you're trying to make ends meet, every month. And that was a phrase that we heard very much at the beginning of the Yellow Vest movement. The protesters talking about struggling at the end of each month, trying to make ends meet. There was a phrase that the people that live at the end of the month, that was a phrase that actually came up. So the fuel tax increase triggered this call. Actually, there was a petition that started on change.org, so largely online-based movement at the very beginning, saying the government needs to cancel the fuel tax and it needs to cancel these other taxes, because the feeling is very much one of why are the super rich, people with 1.3 million euros in assets, why are they getting this massive tax cut, while we're being expected to now pay another 25 cents every time we go to fill up our gas, which already costs about the equivalent of about $6.50 a gallon. So it's this feeling of tax, of injustice. And one of the phrases we heard as well was this idea of fiscal injustice, and calls for fiscal justice. Why are the rich getting this treatment? Why are we being treated this way? And so we saw this first call after the change.org petition that was circulated, a first call to block the country on November 18th. I'm forgetting if it's the 17th or the 18th. It's been a while here. In any case, November 2018, this first call to block the country, organized largely online. There's been a lot of speculation about the involvement of parties, about organizations, but I think it's pretty clear that this originated from grassroots people online. And when I say grassroots, I mean not affiliated to any parties or organizations, really regular people that were fed up and upset about this question of tax injustice. Mm-hmm. And what we saw from the beginning of that movement, and now we're at Act 14 coming up this weekend. Are we at Act 15?
It'll be Act 15.
Excuse me, yeah, sorry, it's hard to keep track of. So every Saturday since that original one, November 2018, coming up on Act 15, what we've seen is the movement expand beyond this question of getting rid of the fuel tax hike, because the government actually conceded on that demand, which we can get to as well in December, but bigger demands about fiscal justice, bigger demands about the rich paying their fair share, bigger demands to defend public services, and demands to have better representation, and questions of giving more power to the people through citizens' referendum. We can get into that as well, but I think it's really important to emphasize here as well is that this is a real working class movement. I don't want to fetishize it, romanticize it in any way, but I think it's a fact that few people will contest that in France today. This is a movement that has been led from the very beginning by working class people and by lower middle class people. There's surveys that bear that out. There's been 2 serious academic studies that have been done about the movement so far, led by sociologists, political scientists, and geographers. And those have found that the people protesting are working class and lower middle class people concerned with questions of tax justice and living standards. So I think that's what the movement is about, and I'll let you.
Well, I was going to say, can you talk about the literal aesthetic of the yellow vest? Why are they with yellow vests?
So that's actually it's a good question. I forgot to mention that. So I mean, this is something that it's a requirement in France. Started several years ago, where drivers have to have yellow vests in their car at all times. So if they pull over to the side of the road, if they have any problems, basically to clearly identify themselves. So drivers in France are supposed to have a yellow vest in their cars. And so that was why this was something that was seen as a kind of universal, pointing common between people that were driving their cars and that were pissed off at basically that they're having to, pay more money. So it's a real, I think in that sense, it's a brilliant, kind of symbol.
Right. And then what of kind of the actual tactic, I guess, of going out on a weekly basis? How are they hoping to translate that kind of into change?
Yeah, so I think, it's evolved as time has gone on. I think at the very beginning, it's important to point out we have not seen the size of protests really match that very first November 2018 protest, the first one, over 200,000 people coming out across the country. So by French standards, the number of protesters today is actually not that significant. I think it's important to point out. I think the most recent one was a little bit over 10,000, if I'm not mistaken, across the country, which is not that significant. But in any case, it was bigger before. But what we've seen was people, the most emblematic, I think, sign of the most emblematic form of protest was going out to these traffic circles, which are really just everywhere in France once you leave the cities. Basically where you have a bunch of different roads that are meeting, and for whatever reason, I don't know much about French urban planning, but there's a lot of these traffic circles just across the country and in rural areas. And this is where people responded to these calls online to just come out and protest against tax injustice and join this movement that they felt was representing their sense of being fed up. And I think what's fascinating too is that these traffic circles are not in the kinds of places that when you think about protests in France, are the kind of typical places. Paris, it's gotten a lot of attention because of the scale and the kind of spectacular images of the protests and the rioting on a few occasions, but most of the action is taking place outside of Paris, and I think that's some of the most interesting part one of the most interesting parts of the movement is this is taking place in the quote-unquote forgotten France, in rural areas and in what's known in France as peri-urban areas. So these kind of semi-urban areas outside of cities, outside of suburbs that are kind of somewhere in between rural areas and the suburbs. And that's really where the Yellow movement has gotten its strength. And I think, you've seen people flocking to these meetings. And I think if you read some of the reports, what's another fascinating element of this is the sense of community that people feel when they come out. It's a sense of coming out every Saturday and talking politics, talking about how things are unfair, talking about what kind of society you want to live in. And I think that's another really important point of the movement is, a few weeks ago I wrote about it for In These Times, but I was out at a neighborhood Yellow Bus meeting in Belleville, so not far from where we're talking right now, in my neighborhood, and it really made me think back to Occupy in 2011. If your viewers and remember that, and maybe you were around that as well. But it's that sense of people talking about what kind of society they want to live in. Really messy too. People will mix in. We should go protest a bank. We should go keep protesting in rich neighborhoods. We should light McDonald's on fire. But also we want to live in a socialist society. No, we want to live in a society that just treats people better. So this really kind of free-flowing, messy, utopian kind of conversation. Again, I don't want to romanticize that, but that's really the kind of feeling here, and I think that's exhilarating for a lot of people. It's the sense of being able to talk about politics and what kind of society you want to live in.
Can you talk about the different types of factions that are out there? So, like, my experience in Act 13 was that there was actually some strife when there was black bloc-clad Antifa types with kind of communist flags, Karl Marx type symbols, and then someone who I had dinner with the night before who was a much more moderate person kind of came up to me and was like, they're kind of messing it up, actually. Like, his opinion seemed to be that, he didn't agree with their tactics and he didn't want to go quite as far on the politics. So that seemed representative of a larger point about their kind of movement.
Yeah, no, I think it's true. There are different factions in the movement. I think so. Referring back to one of the studies I had mentioned, it's by a research center in Bordeaux, I believe, where they talked about. They asked the question to Yellow Vests. This is an academic research study. They asked the question, how do you identify on the political spectrum? Or the first question was, do you identify on the left-right spectrum? And then if so, how do you identify? And I think it showed that 33%, so about a third of people, don't situate themselves anywhere on the left or right spectrum, which is actually a little bit above the national average. So that's an important, I think, point to make, is that people that are thinking politically but don't really have a firm sense of political identity, whether it's left or right. However, if you look at the people that do have, that do feel a connection to the left or right spectrum, most of the people, at least according to the study, and I think my experiences at least covering it and talking to folks bears this out, is that people tend to skew to the left in terms of protesters. And the demands they're talking about, I think in a different era would have been part of, the Communist Party or the Socialist Party, this working class base that used to flock to the left. Things like, tax justice, hiking taxes on the rich, increasing the minimum wage, defending public services. There is a real kind of classic left-wing base, even if it doesn't go by the label left, and people reject the left-wing parties. The actual ideas, I think, are very emblematic of a kind of traditional, left-wing platform. But it's true as well that there is a more right-wing, if you want to call it that, part of the movement, which is much more about this question of we hear sovereignty a lot in France coming up, which I think I think shouldn't immediately scare people off the word. I know it kind of sends it can be a little shrill on progressives' ears in the U.S. and to my ears as well to some extent. But sovereignty, this idea of, which in France refers back to the French Revolution, this idea that the people ultimately have power and that they should be the ones that make decisions. And this is often contrasted with the government that's sold out to the rich, but also Brussels and the European Union, and you see kind of some frustrations that are being articulated there. So against the European Union for defending France, and popular revolt as almost being the kind of incarnation of France, going back to this kind of romantic, Victor Hugo, Les Miserables idea, which is really does exist in France today. The French Revolution being a kind of universal idea. But all that said, that is the more kind of, if you want to call it, right-leaning or conservative sovereigntist part of the movement. They're definitely there. We've actually seen some clashes between different factions. It was a few weeks ago, I think, at this point, where left-wing protesters were actually attacked by fascist supporters of the Yellow Vests. You have monarchists that are involved. You have communists that are involved. Trotskyists. You have anarchists. You mentioned the Black Bloc; they're out there as well. So it is a fascinating mix of people.
So an interesting phenomenon that I've seen is that of Americans who are interested in this, I've seen a lot of MAGA types. I've seen a lot of Trump type people who are expressing support for the Yellow Vests. Can you kind of contrast it to American politics? Is there an analogy to be made there? Are they analogous to any political movement in the United States? I guess what should Americans be seeing in this?
No, I mean, it's a good question. I'm instinctively want to compare, and I'm an internationalist, and I don't think borders really are the ultimate end all be all of people's way of viewing politics. But at the same time, that all being said, the more I've kind of watched this movement, the more I think it is a really kind of French phenomenon. I think it's interesting if you look at like you mentioned, the Yellow Vest kind of sympathizers outside of France do tend to be pretty conservative. I don't really have a great idea of why that is, but it certainly seems to be the case if you look at like in the UK, the kind of Tommy Robinson supporting crowd was wearing Yellow Vests. In Belgium it was much more kind of right wing. So I don't know if I have a great explanation for that, but I think in France at least, I lost my train of thought there a little bit about the right. So I think one important point here is there's this sense that I think if you view it with an American lens and you see, okay, people are upset about this fuel tax, this is a kind of conservative could be almost a conservative kind of rallying cry. Big government saying, you're going to have to spend more money on fuel, and the people saying, screw that, we want to drive our cars, basically. And I think like that kind of framework, I think that isn't really what's happening. Mm-hmm. I think what's this is a line I've told other people as well, but I think when people are protesting against the fuel tax, they're not saying for the government to get out of people's lives. What they're saying is they want the government to treat people more fairly. People appreciate deeply in France, and the LFS too, the role of the state in the economy, in providing a safety net, in providing public services. They deeply support that. What they care for is what they want is to act more equitably, to act more justly. I think that's what's happening here. And so if you just see people protesting the state, if you're in the U.S., you can kind of think of that in kind of libertarian or conservative terms. But in France, people look to the state as a source of it's the arbiter of political action and political life. And so you look to the state to solve problems, and when things are not fair, then you blame the state. And that's not a question of people wanting to get rid of the state's role in their lives. It's a question of how is the state acting. I think that's an important point here.
One of the I had dinner off the record with with somebody who is involved in the LFS, and his strife is with his employer, which is Amazon. Can you talk about particularly kind of multinational, the kind of gigantic corporations, and this also kind of parallels it to the United States, where we're having some strife over Amazon. How do they kind of feel about the big corporations? Also, one person asks, what is the price of gas in dollars? If you could put just the price of gas and then what that would have.
So I think that the Times did the math on this. This is a figure I've cited as well, so I hope it's right. I think it is right. Fact checking it. So the Times said if you translate it from euros and liters into dollars and gallons, it's about $6.50 a gallon, which is massive when you think about it. And you have to factor in that French people are making less money overall. Median income is, I think around 1,700 euros a month. To give you a sense of things, you obviously you're not paying for healthcare and you have better public services, but nevertheless, that's a big chunk of people's income. And your question about
Amazon.
Yeah.
Basically, what is the kind of French view of these big multinational corporations as opposed to small businesses, and how they should be treated differently?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can give you a great response to that question, but I think in France, there is at least compared to the U.S., I think more of a hostility towards corporations and big business, at least. I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but I think there is an appreciation for small business and local business. I think that's much stronger here, and you can probably see it even while you've been here in the city. There's less corporate establishments that are everywhere, and I think that's.
And I've noticed that on Act 13, I saw a lot more property destruction than Act 14, and it seemed to be almost exclusively targeted toward banks and a few like luxury luxury and jewelry and that kind of store, but they were not attacking coffee shops.
Yeah. No, that's this is a much debated protest tactic in left-wing circles, and it's something that the anarchists and what are called here the autonomists do a lot, the black bloc kind of types, which is targeting Starbucks. Not many Starbucks in France. McDonald's actually more. I've seen more McDonald's go up in flames than anything else. Been on a few protests where the McDonald's is targeted, and banks, as you pointed out as well. So and a lot of businesses have been impacted as well by the movement. People were boarding up their their shops, and I think right around the Christmas, the holiday season, when it was peak shopping season for Galeries Lafayette, the big department store in Paris, they had to basically shut down on a huge shopping weekend. So this has impacted business, everywhere.
Why do they see sort of destruction of businesses as a tactic that could be advantageous to them, at least for the small portion of them that actually does it?
Yeah, you'd have to talk to autonomists to get the real perspective. I'm not terribly sympathetic to it as a protest tactic, although it probably gets focused on a little too much. But I think the idea is these are kind of insurrectionary anarchists that believe that if you're gonna by showing how you can destroy a corporation, that's going to rally people to your side. I'm not sure it's that convincing of a case, which is why I'm not able to articulate it with
and
much passion.
To be clear to my own audience, I saw very little of that compared to the supposedly Act 13 had 50,000 people, and I would say that a very small proportion of people were involved in that kind of
No, yeah, and I think the bigger question, which maybe you're about to ask here, is this question of police violence. I mean, that to me,
exactly what I was going to get
I mean, that to me is the real. When we talk about violence, McDonald's and an empty McDonald's having a window, broken, I think pales in comparison to the hundreds, I think at this point more than thousands of people that have been injured coming out to these protests. And when I talk to people that are sympathetic with the movement that are a little bit older, they don't want to come to the protest because they know that there's tear gas flying everywhere, that you can lose a limb. That's happened a few times. In France, the police use these very specific kinds of grenades that have not used elsewhere in the European Union, basically to get crowds to move back. And these things, these are actual grenades that are like military-like grenades. And it's happened now on a few occasions where protesters have had one of these drop it for them, and they've picked it up to throw back or try to kick it away, and they've actually lost limbs as a result of these grenades exploding, which sounds insane when you think about, this is a democracy and a country where people supposedly have the right to protest, but exorbitant use of police violence. So people losing limbs, the grenades I think is an important part, but also just routinely, police officers stepping out of bounds and beating people. We've seen all kinds of injuries. I think over 1,000 people and actually a few deaths as well from kind of peripheral to the protest. So I think that's a real question here. And unfortunately, the government doesn't want to talk about that.
Yeah. So those were I think they were the GLI F4 grenades that have 25 grams of TNT in them before they fire the tear gas. So I was about 100 feet from the guy who lost his hand a week and a half ago. Sadly, I mean, so more. I haven't seen anything like that in the United States, where I've seen a lot of tear gas, flash grenades, whatever, but I have never seen weapons like that being used. What is sort of the law enforcement's goal when they're out there? So this is something that really has puzzled me, because from an American perspective, usually the police seem to be, they're trying to protect free speech, theoretically, they're trying to give room to protest, and then they're trying to protect property and people, right? From getting hurt. It seems like here, not much property is protected. People get hurt a lot. And they're not really doing a whole lot of law enforcement. I actually don't see a lot of arrests. So, what are they doing?
I think there have been a lot of arrests. Maybe I don't know.
Well, I guess compared to the amount of violence. The amount of, it seems like there's a lot more beating of people than actually arresting of people, at least from what I witnessed. But so from your perspective, what is the law enforcement actually trying to do?
They're, I think, a generous, I'll start with the generous interpretation, which is, they want to prevent, extremists from coming out, and creating property damage, and attacking people. I think that's one element of it. I think, there's the kind of typical approach, I think, of law enforcement protests, which you outlined. I think is definitely a part of it. But I think it's pretty clear as well that the massive use of force here is clearly meant as a factor to dissuade people from protesting. I think that's a point of view that's increasingly common. That isn't even a kind of fringe viewpoint. I think it's pretty clear the government doesn't want people to continue going to these protests. First in France, unlike the U.S., France does have free assembly and free speech. At the same time, those rights are not as guaranteed as they are in the U.S. France has a complicated system of having to declare protests. And so undeclared protests, typically people aren't arrested for organizing them. There's a reform, we can get to that later. But there is more of a police presence for undeclared protests. So I think that's part of it as well, to dissuade people from doing undeclared protests. But overall, there's a clear goal here from law enforcement to get people not to protest. And it works, like I mentioned. You talk to older folks, no one wants to come to a protest where, there's tear gas flying and you can, lose a limb again. So I think that's a clear factor here. And I think that's even more borne out by the fact that just recently, so several weeks ago, the government now pursuing this new law, basically, which they call the loi anti-casseur. So casseur in French meaning, it kind of loosely translates to rioter, but it comes from the verb to break. So basically people that are just the breakers, breaking stuff, which is this kind of catch-all phrase the government and the police use to describe basically troublemakers and quote-unquote bad guys. But it's a really kind of general term. And so the idea for this law, the loi anti-casseur, which the government is now seeing through, and it's going to be debated in the Senate soon before it comes back to the National Assembly. It's already been passed by the Assembly one time. The idea of this is to basically make it easier for the police to control people coming into the protests. First off, so giving the police more power to have a broad perimeter around protests, and having more controls of people coming into the protests. Secondly, I think this is the most important part, is giving power to judges, administrative judges, to not judges, local administrations. France is a different structure, to prevent people from protesting before they've come out to protest. So banning people from being able to protest, which sounds insane to American ears, and it should. In France, even, I think is incredibly alarming. And so that's the step we've seen the government taking here, trying to ban specific people from protesting. Now, if that's not an indication of their intent to dissuade people from protesting, I don't know what is. It's clear this is meant as a way to get people to stop going to these protests.
I do have a follow up on that, but I had a commenter who said, "Great interview, great command of the history and facts." So I wanted to share that compliment with you. But he wanted to know which media outlets you write for. He was curious about that because I didn't clarify in this.
Yeah, so I write for The Nation. I write for Jacobin. I write for In These Times, The Atlantic as well. You can go to my website also. It's colestangler.com. Yeah.
I think I had there was another comment with a question on here, but in any event, what I was going to get to was, it seemed like there was also an anti-masking law or statute or something.
Sorry, yeah, we need to that. Right, that's another thing. That would make it, right now it's technically unlawful in France to put a mask on at a protest. You get the equivalent of basically a citation. So what this new proposal, it still needs to be put into law and approved by the Senate and the National Assembly on its second reading. But what this new proposal would turn that into a crime, like a full crime, punishable by, I think it's I don't want to give you wrong information, but I think up to a year in prison and a massive fine, worth tens of thousands of euros, at least over 10,000 euros. Check the exact figures on that and the amount of prison time, but certainly prison time and a massive fine, turning that right now, which is a citation, into an actual crime. Again, for masking your face in a protest. So pretty frightening, and I think that signals how afraid the government is of this movement. I think that's another point here, is the way that they've responded. They're terrified of this because typically in France, when you see people, the way that the government deals with protests, whether it's and it typically tends to be union protests and labor movement protests. And that's what we've seen in France. The most the biggest street movements come from labor, and the typical way of dealing with that in France is you sit down and you make some concessions and you negotiate. And you know exactly who to negotiate with. You can peel off a union or two. You know what they want, and you can talk to them. What's terrified them about the Yellow Vests is there is seemingly no official negotiator here. We saw that at the very beginning, I think in December, where the government wanted to sit down with a few different leaders, people that had put out these calls on Facebook. But again, these are unofficial leaders, and that attempt did not work. But there's a real kind of sense in the government that they didn't know who to talk to. And again, I should also say that we're at a point in the movement here where it's, I think, back on the decline. There was a peak, I think, in November, December, when the government made those concessions. So the government repealing that fuel tax, or saying they were not going to implement that fuel tax hike that got everyone upset in the first place. So they did that. Macron also in December expanded a wage subsidy for low-income workers, and they also de-taxed overtime pay effective in 2019. So a bunch of concessions in December. That was the peak of the movement. It declined a little bit around the holidays, and then people thought it was going away. It picked up again at the beginning of January. Now we see it kind of on the decline again. I think last weekend was one of the smallest turnouts, if I'm not mistaken, that we've seen since the beginning of the movement. We've also seen public opinion correspondingly decline. At the beginning of the movement, it was around 70%. Today, public opinion is around 50%. I think in the latest poll I saw from IFOP, which is done good polling. So it's 70%, 50%. 50% support the movement, around 30% oppose it, and the rest don't have an opinion. So 50%. At the same time, Macron has about 30% in the polls. So
right.
Yellow Vests are more popular than Emmanuel Macron. In French terms, 50% support for any political party movement, I think, is significant, because there's such a such a backlash and hostility towards all kinds of political parties at the moment that 50% is impressive even.
On the mask and kind of face issue, I've seen that a comment that I've gotten from people, particularly as I'm out there with a camera, is they're worried about their face being seen because they feel like they could lose their job. I've spoken to one person who did lose their job because of their participation. Can you kind of talk about that issue? And do you feel like the state is intentionally using kind of anti-masking statutes in order to leverage people's jobs against them, to disincentivize protesting?
Yeah, I'm not so sure about that. I don't have that strong opinion on that, but it's true. I think we saw with Amazon laid off, or at least is attempting to fire workers for supporting the yellow vest, and one of the good things about France is that labor laws are a little bit more equitable and fair towards workers. So there's much more hoops you have to go through to be able to fire someone in France for cause, and that's a good thing. But I think we've seen a few isolated cases of employers trying to target their employees because of their support for the movement.
One person commented, and this isn't exactly related, but it could be. They asked, "Does college charge tuition, or is it free in France?" What is kind of the situation, and do the LFS have demands related to education reform? I'm actually not sure of this.
The tuition in France is not free, but it's in American terms basically free. I think for undergraduate at a public universities, you're paying about, I think, a little bit over 100 euros per year, or no, per semester. Mm-hmm. No, it's per year. Yeah, about 100 euros per year. So it's you spend 3 years undergrad. That's you can do the math. So
I mean, that's nothing in the American.
I don't want to say it's nothing.
Yeah.
People shouldn't be spending that much, but it's true that compared to the U.S., it's basically effectively free. On the other hand, one element we have seen come up in the LFS movement is that a recent reform among the many, I think, unfortunate and ultimately bad reforms being pursued by this government is to hike the cost of tuition for foreign students that are coming from outside the EU. So, I think also interesting to see how Macron, who's painted as this kind of liberal champion who supports immigrants and migrant rights against the bad, evil Le Pen, Macron, the great liberal, now actually trying to hike tuition for foreign students outside the EU, which in France means basically people from North Africa, the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa, French speakers from Algeria, from Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, etc. Those are the kinds of students that are being impacted by this rate hike, and it's really significant in French terms. So hiking tuition rates from right now, which is they're paying basically the French costs, and it'll be going up to thousands, a little bit over. The masters I know we'll go up to around 2,000 euros per year, which is really significant, and the undergrad's a little bit less than that. And we've actually seen as a result of that some attempts from universities to try to link support for the Yellow Vest to solidarity with foreign students. And we haven't talked about that at all, but the student movement also has in certain universities been providing more support to Yellow Vest than others, and that definitely is a component of the movement.
Yeah, I actually went to Act 1 of a protest at Invalides that was on specifically that issue of tuition hikes for migrants. But so getting into that exact subject, this seems to be an issue where the nationalism versus globalism, or what have you, seems to be also different factions within the LFS. Where do they stand on the issue of migration?
Yeah, I think so. I think I mentioned at the beginning of the interview. There are basically, to my knowledge, two major academic studies that have been done about the Yellow Vest. I was mentioning one, the Bordeaux one. There's another one that came out a little bit before that, where they asked people what their main concerns were. And if you look at those concerns, basically that you have this question of purchasing power, the way they talk about pouvoir d'achat, so the ability your ability to buy things. It sounds consumerist, but basically purchasing power. So concern about rising living standards, concern about being taxed too much, concerns about wealth distribution, about public services. Those are really the main issues. And I think in that study I mentioned, it was less than 5%. So they were motivated by hostility towards immigration. So I think, it's to me it's a pretty marginal concern of protesters, either one way or the other. And that's not to kind of cop out of your question here, but it just, to my knowledge, that hasn't been a major factor of the protest. You certainly have some kind of nastier far right supporters of the movement, the kind of sovereigntist wing that I was talking about earlier, that want to limit immigration in France. And we've seen some prominent supporters of the movement talking about, so in particular, and again, I want to emphasize before getting to this that it's a pretty marginal part of the movement, but we've seen this kind of outcry, and we saw it in the US as well a little bit, but with the Marrakesh Pact, so this UN migration pact that was signed by a bunch of countries, and the US did not sign it. I believe Donald Trump pulled out of the declaration, as did Brazil under Jair Bolsonaro. And it's a very, one of these kind of international pacts that's basically harmless and doesn't have really much binding power. But nevertheless, people saw this in France. Some supporters of the LFS saw this in France as this is the UN and the European Union encroaching on France's ability to protect its borders. And look, now we're going to have waves of migration coming from Africa and the Middle East. And we need to stop this immediately. We need to give power to the people to let them to decide. And if you gave the French people power, they would never allow this, basically, was the line. Mm-hmm. And, we saw some hostility towards the Marrakesh Pact on Yellow Vest Facebook pages. And some of these discussions in the Facebook groups can get pretty nasty. I don't want to sugarcoat it. If you read these groups, it can get conspiratorial, anti-Semitic, racist, just flat out racist, I think, at certain points. So, that's lingering there on the internet. But again, if you go to the protests, people aren't, waving banners to stop immigration. It's clearly not, part of the main agenda of what people are protesting.
Yeah. To that end, you mentioned anti-Semitism, which has been brought into the kind of forefront. I think 2 days ago I was at a rally that the Prime Minister and 2 former presidents were at, dealing with that. I've seen it used as an attack against the LFS, that they've been called anti-Semitic, but I haven't personally witnessed anything that implies that on the street. What have you sort of seen on that subject? I
mean, I personally haven't seen really clear anti-Semitic acts from Yellow Vest supporters, but it clearly, that definitely seems to have happened in more than a few occasions. Mm-hmm. The most recent one, which has sparked a lot of outcry and is being weaponized, but nevertheless did happen, I think is important to condemn, was this kind of provocative philosopher, Alan Finkielkraut, was walking around his neighborhood in the Posh, near Posh, I think it's the 14th, if I'm not mistaken, or near Montparnasse in any case. And, he was called, dirty Zionist. He wasn't called dirty Jew, but he was called dirty Zionist, and clearly, insulted in a really anti-Semitic kind of way. That's been decried. But it's not only that. We've seen other accounts of, I think on Twitter, one that got a lot of attention at the beginning of the movement was, someone chanting anti-Jewish slogans in the metro, and a woman getting up and, older woman saying, I was living in France at the time of the deportations and the Holocaust. This is disgusting, and basically no one coming to her defense in the metro. And we've seen people talking about anti-Semitic abuse. So again, I think this is part of the a movement that it's not the majoritarian part of it, but it definitely is there. And I think this goes to, the Yellow Vest movement is a messy movement that's coming from the grassroots, and this is not to excuse any xenophobic or anti-Semitic parts of the movement, but when you're talking about a grassroots working class movement that's coming up without support from political parties, people are saying what they're thinking, and they're saying how they feel, and that's a problem in France. I think we should all be really concerned about anti-Semitism, but this is it's there. So it's not a good response, but it's there, and it's alarming. So I think it underscores the need to to address hate and xenophobia and anti-Semitism, because I think they're all connected. I was talking to someone last night, who's a Turkish immigrant in France, talking about how anti-Semitism is a problem, and you can see it in the neighborhood we're in right now, which is actually one of the more Jewish neighborhoods, and it's a problem. I don't know how else to say it.
One of the only, I guess, nationalist or right-wing type things that I've seen on the street is I have seen some signs calling for a Frexit, right? The idea of exiting the EU, that kind of thing. How much of a role has that kind of had in their coalition? Does that seem like a popular opinion?
I think the Frexit's again pretty. I don't think the Frexit is a majoritarian position. I think it fits into this broader question of sovereignty and giving power to the people and giving French citizens the ability to decide the future of their country, as opposed to Macron and his government of the rich and also by connection the European Union, which Macron is on good terms with. I think that's the biggest kind of rallying cry. We see some support for Frexit, but we see I think the closest. The single greatest demand that I think is shared by protesters today is not Frexit, but it's this thing. It's this question of the Citizens Referendum Initiative, the RIC, so the RIC, and this is basically a proposal to give citizens the ability to propose their own legislation and to vote on it via referendum, via national referendum, the ability to repeal laws that they don't like, and the ability to also repeal legislators that they don't like, so people in the National Assembly. And the idea is this is the magic bullet. Or something close to it that's going to revitalize French democracy and restore power to the people. I think that's the clearest kind of single demand we've seen of the movement right now. That I see that much more than I see calls for Frexit. Sometimes they overlap, but I think the RIC, the RIC, the Citizens Referendum is really the biggest demand here.
I've seen a ton of signs about RIC, but something I have had a hard time getting an answer for is like, what exactly do you want voted on? Like, they love the idea of the very direct democracy, and it seems very hard to put the Yellow Vests' positions into like clear questions. Have you seen a more specific answer on that?
No, I think you're right. You mentioned the ambiguity of it. I think it goes back to this idea, which harkens back, or it's a lot of the imagery and the discourse around the French Revolution, is mobilized around it. This idea of, giving back power to the people. But you're right. They haven't said exactly what that is going to be used to implement. It's more a question of, I think, people responding to this lack of a sense that they have no control over the government, a sense that the government isn't serving them, and that they want to have the ability to make decisions that impact their lives and their friends' lives. I think that's, and their families' lives. I think that's really what's underlying it. But no, I think you've absolutely touched on the kind of ambiguity here.
I've had a couple commenters now asking about, it seems like this issue probably isn't so much of an issue in France because it's already settled, but I've seen some people asking about healthcare. In short and American terms, I guess, can you explain how is the current healthcare system in France, and is there any Yellow Vest demand on the subject, or is it kind of already, where they want it?
Yeah, healthcare hasn't really surfaced that much. I think it comes up in the context of, we've seen parts of protesters talk about the decline in public services and the problems in public services. But let me try to reformulate here. I think the central question of healthcare in France is, it's largely government provided, and Social Security reimburses a big chunk of healthcare costs. Costs are much lower, and some people have an additional private insurance in addition to their Social Security, which everyone gets to cover some of the costs. But in general, healthcare costs are pretty low, so we don't see that much frustration, at least I haven't, about the cost of healthcare. What we see more is a frustration about public services and the state of hospitals and the lack of funding for hospitals. This idea that the government is withdrawing from hospitals the same way they're withdrawing from funding schools and funding the post office, and it's, I think, connected to a bigger discussion around disinvestment in public services. That's how we see it come up, and especially these protesters that are coming in that are from parts of the country that might only have one hospital or a couple hospitals in their vicinity, in their department of France, and see the conditions there and think it's unfair that they're not being funded more. The same way that they might only have a post office, that's 10 miles, 15 miles away, or seeing their post office closed. So I think that's the way it's come up more. It's less about the cost and more about the quality of hospitals and the investment in hospitals.
There was a question that makes an assumption that I'm not sure is true, but somebody asked, why aren't unions in support of the Yellow Vest movement? I'm not sure if that's accurate, but however you would want to answer that.
No, it's true that organized labor in France was very reluctant at the beginning of the movement to throw their support behind it. And I think that was also because at the beginning of the movement, so going back to November 2018, when this first call went out to blockade the country against the fuel tax and against taxes, I know I was explaining how that's not exactly right-wing, in how the movement isn't exactly right-wing when you think about it in American terms, but at the same time, to unionists and to left-wingers in France, when you hear that kind of call to blockade the economy against taxes, that's not a super progressive kind of demand. I think it wasn't only until a couple weeks later that we saw that this clearly was a broader working class movement that was pushing for something bigger, that however difficult it is to explain what they want, responding to this deeper frustration with the rising cost of living. And that was when unions started, I think, interrogating themselves more. We've seen in the local level, unions supporting protests in a number of different cities. In other cities, when unions have tried to support protests, they've been booed and, moved away. And we've seen, I think union headquarters in a few places, tagged with graffiti. But we've seen also coalitions in other cities working. In Paris, I've been to protests where you have trade unionists from hospitals, from teachers, from schools coming out and supporting the protests. So it's a mixed bag. And then finally, on the national level, we did see the beginning of this month in February 5th, I believe, the CGT union, France's second biggest union, the historically communist union, actually having a day of action in support of the movement on Tuesday, it was on a Tuesday in the middle of the week. Mm-hmm. So breaking with these Saturday protests that the LOS has been doing every act, going back to November, calling for a strike on Tuesday, interrupting the work week to support the movement. And that, it drew, I think, tens of thousands of people across the country. In France, about 18,000 people. In Paris, about 18,000 according to the police, which means it was probably a little bit bigger than that. But so we have seen some efforts, and the unions in France, I think, were reluctant to support this movement, that they didn't know where it was going. It was difficult to kind of get a read on, and I think it was a mistake. And they've been feeling backlash from members on the national level, and then on the local level, it's a little more complicated. It really depends on where you are.
Mm-hmm. And so, can you tell me also about the red scarves? These people kind of counter protesting the yellow vests. What are they all about?
Yeah, that was a protest we saw a few weeks ago. And now at this point, that had been called for by a Macron supporter who was saying, ça suffit, that this is enough. These protests are causing too much damage to cities, to businesses. They're not reflective of what the majority wants. It's kind of called for the silent majority to rise up and defend law and order and these protests basically. And we saw, I believe some deputies from Macron's party partaking in the demonstrations unofficially. So in France, when deputies come out to protest, they typically have these kind of, I don't know how you call it, these like sachets, or I don't know if that's a word. Yeah. These kind of like bands, the red, white, and blue, to indicate they're deputies. They went to those the protest without wearing those, so unofficially, so in support of the protest. But that happened. It kind of fizzled out. There hasn't been a call to have another one of those. I think the bigger offensive, if you want to use that word, from the government is this great national debate, is what they've called. So this debate, which was originally one of the concessions that Macron made in December, along with canceling the fuel tax hike and along with the wage subsidy and the detaxing of overtime pay, Macron said, okay, we understand you're frustrated. We're going to address this deep malaise with a great national debate taking place in the beginning of 2019, where we're going to be talking to mayors and having assemblies throughout the country to discuss what it is you really want. And we've seen those debates begin, and Macron having these, town halls where he speaks for hours and hours on end and really shining as a politician, I think. As much as I'm not particularly, as much as I'm not fond of Macron, I think, he's been able to do these well. But there's also been a lot of opposition to the great debate, seeing it as a kind of a ploy to detract from people's anger. And I think another key critique, for me, the single greatest critique of the great debate is there's no binding mechanism in there to say that whatever comes out of whatever grievances that come out of the debate are going to be actually translated into policy. The government's not saying we're promising to pick the next the top 3 grievances and act on them. They're saying, give us your grievances and we're going to dissect them and we're going to issue a report and potentially do something about it. So it's very vague. I think the lack of a real accountability mechanism, I think, really shows what the debate is about.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of protesters with signs talking about the great debate, mostly basically calling it BS. I've seen a lot of people say that basically they just think that it's an opportunity for Macron to talk and make it seem like he's sympathizing, but that he's not actually. I
think a lot of people have that opinion. Yeah.
Has there been any other concession by the government? Have there been, other than not doing the tax and then the debate? Has Macron done anything to respond to them in their favor?
Yeah, so we've seen. So the very first concession was okay. The government was not. Government decided to cancel the planned tax hike in 2019. So and then in addition to that, a few weeks later, or I believe a week later, Macron, this kind of humiliating speech he had to give because he didn't want to make concessions to the movement. He made a series of concessions, which I mentioned. So expanding the wage subsidy. It was initially unveiled in a way that suggested he might be increasing the minimum wage, but ultimately not. Ultimately, he's expanding a state program that gives basically subsidizes people that are making pay below a certain level, so up to 100 euros a month in a boosted pay through that. We've seen the de-taxing of overtime pay. So basically, you're not paying social charges, contributions to French Social Security on pay above 40 hours, 35 to 40 hours a week. The official work week is 35 hours a week. People often work more than that. And then we've seen also the third thing, which I hadn't mentioned, of those three concessions in addition to the fuel tax hike being canceled, was a plan to decrease a new tax hike that was affecting a new tax hike that was affecting retirees on their pension benefits. So those three things, in addition to the fuel tax hike being canceled, in addition to the great national debate. That's where we're at today. And I think one just kind of important commentary, I think, about those concessions is that Macron was somebody who, I think it was, to me, it was such a classic Macron move because all those three concessions were all coming out of state coffers. It was all public money. This is someone who talks a lot about, who has supported European budget rules that prevent countries from spending, from having their deficits go above a certain level, so the 3% rule preventing governments from spending more than 3% of their having deficits that go beyond 3% of their GDP. Macron has supported those kinds of austeritarian rules in the EU, and yet at the same time, he's willing to make these expensive concessions to the protests, and I think it shows you to what extent he will not ask the rich to pay more money. He will not ask businesses to pay more money. He does not want the private sector to make the concessions. He'll say, fine, you're angry, the state will be able to address these concerns, but God forbid he consider repealing re-implement the wealth tax. That's just been a no-go, and that's one of the demands that we've seen continue as well is
right.
The wealth tax.
One person comments, and it gets to exactly what you were just saying. If he's opposed to these increases in gas prices or taxes, what's the alternative to increase government revenue? It seems like it would basically be more progressive taxes on upper middle class and rich people. So it seems like you kind of just answered that. But a few people have been commenting about, and I've only seen this come up once in the protest, but they were asking about marijuana laws. Has that been an issue for Yellow Vests? It doesn't seem like it's as much of a social...
I haven't seen that at all.
Yeah, so I've seen literally one time at La Republique that there was...
I've seen people smoking in protests, but I haven't seen any demands related to that.
Is that really even a political issue here? What is... It seems like there's...
I don't think it's as organized as it is in the U.S. I think people, around, our generation think that it probably should be legal, but I don't think I don't think there's as much of an organized political, response to the laws like the one we have in the U.S. right now. And
the current state in France is that it's kind of the equivalent of our decriminalization, like it's a citation but not arrestable, is my understanding. Do you even know? I'm not sure what the... You shouldn't... I shouldn't give my opinion about things that I'm not sure about. Yeah. I find it to be mostly irrelevant. I only ask because I see a ton of people commenting about that for some reason. Yeah. I guess going forward, what direction do you see all of this kind of taking? It seems like eventually somebody's got to either concede that things aren't changing, or the government's got to change something to get them to kind of stop. I guess what direction is this all going in, or what directions could it go in? Well, I mean, I don't want to predict too much because I think anyone that's tried to predict this movement has been proven wrong, because no one expected this to happen. No one expected government to concede. No one expected it to continue to go on. So I think you'd be a fool to try to say what's going to happen. All that being said, I think what to look for is this debate, the great national debate, as it's being called. How is that going to turn out? The government is continuing that process until March. In April, they have to issue this report. So the question is, how are they going to act with these grievances that come up? Are they going to propose some kind of referendum? Are they going to
can make another concession, probably not, but potentially. And I think we'll see how people respond to that. I think the debate is one element. Other than that, the protests have been continuing to decline at the moment, so that could continue. I'm not so sure. I think the big thing is the debate, honestly, and I think what's clear here, at least now for the rest of Macron's presidency, whether it takes the form of the yellow vest or not, is that Macron portrayed himself as a president who, unlike previous French presidents, was he was not going to concede to the pressures of the street. This was someone who was going to stand firm, who was going to implement his reform agenda. He uses this word reform like it's a magic word. It's like, I'm going to reform the country, reform. And he said that he was going to continue that regardless of public opinion and regardless of the opposition. And the single biggest thing of the yellow vest, I think, is they've shown this government will be moved, and they have made this humiliating set of concessions that they never wanted to make, and that they basically had to concede to regular, ordinary people rising up and saying, we don't support your policies because you don't have a popular mandate. And I think that's the thing that's going to be hanging over Macron's agenda for the next 3 years now, until 2022 when he's up for re-election, regardless of his big majority in the National Assembly, regardless of how many seats his party wins in the European elections coming up in May. I think that's going to be looming over the presidency, and that's a signal too to other groups of the population and also the labor movement and the left who've been kind of sidelined and weakened for years now, especially under Macron, that actually, if you organize enough and if you make enough ruckus, you can get this government to move. I think that's the takeaway.
I did have one question that I sort of forgot about, which is that it seems like hiking up the minimum wage is a really big demand. In kind of American terms, where is kind of the baseline wage floor, and where would they like it to be? Right. In American terms, we think of like the fight for 15 as kind of the, I guess, equivalent policy question.
Yeah, I think it's like 8 or 9 euros in French. In France, also, it's people think of wage mostly in monthly terms because people's paychecks come in terms of the month. I think it's around 8 or 9 euros. So a little bit more than the U.S., but still not as strong as it should be. So that's definitely a demand that we've seen.
Do you know about how much they're trying to rise the floor?
I think it depends on who you ask. I think the unions have talked about 12 euros. We've seen that demand come out. I think if you look at the union pamphlets, I think unions also just call for a general hike in the minimum wage. Mm-hmm. But I think 12 is a number I've heard. 12 euros an hour, yeah.
So I think I've basically asked everything that I've seen in the comments and then what I had on my mind. But is there anything else that you'd want to share, particularly understanding that it's mostly an American audience looking at this issue in Europe? Is there anything else that you'd want them to kind of know about what's happening here?
Yeah. I think it's a messy movement. I don't want to portray it too positively either, because as I was pointing out, there's all kinds of kind of nastier underlying parts about anti-Semitism, about anti-European and anti-immigrant kind of rhetoric that's circulating. Again, not majoritarian, but still part of the movement. So I don't want to universally celebrate it. All that being said, I think it's a clear it's a clear reminder that people have the ability to organize however messily they want to do so, and get governments, powerful governments, to concede and do things that they otherwise wouldn't do. So that's the real lesson here. Like any other big social movement, is that ordinary people, when they organize and rise up, they can accomplish things.